Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Stengel, and I'm the Special Events Director for the Women's Leadership Initiative at the University of Delaware. And I'm thrilled to welcome you here this morning to the second in our Allyship Advocacy and Accompliceship webinar series. Over 3,000 of you joined us in our spring Leadership in Times of Crisis series. So we were thrilled to be able to come back this fall, bringing a new look at allyship, advocacy, and accompliceship in response to some of the social injustice issues that came along with the pandemic this spring. As many of you know, we have additional sessions coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we invite you to join us for those. We have sessions designed to focus on allyship for people of color, for the LGBTQ population, and also women as advocates and allies for each other in the boardroom. We are extremely thrilled to welcome back our partners, the Delaware Business Times and Delaware Prosperity Partnership, and to welcome our new sponsors for this series, InvestNet, Insight, and Richards, Layton and Finger. I know at this point, many of you are Zoom pros, but just as a reminder, we are in the Zoom webinar format, which means while you can see us, we cannot see or hear you. But as always, we welcome you to participate in the chat, to drop your observations, any resources that you might be familiar with, and also questions, as we will have time for a Q&A later at the end of the session. Also, we will be live tweeting throughout, and we invite you to do so as well. You can join us on Twitter at UD Women Lead and use the hashtag Women Allyship. So I'm incredibly honored today to welcome our two speakers. And any of you who have been active on social media in the last couple of weeks may recognize the faces and names of David Smith and Brad Johnson. They are gender in the workplace experts who show why and how men have a crucial role to play in promoting gender equality at work. A sociologist and a clinical psychologist, they are professors and formal naval officers with a mission to help men become more effective allies, accomplices, mentors, and collaborators with women to create a more inclusive workplace. And we are incredibly fortunate to have them as they are hot on the heels of the release of their recent book, Good Guys, and have been keeping an incredible pace with different webinars, podcasts, and appearances with respect to the book, and actually the very timely release of their book, given some of the recent issues that have been cropping up for us, for women in the workplace. So Brad and Dave, welcome. We're so happy to have you with us this morning.
Amy, great to be with you.
Delighted to be here, Amy. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, congratulations on the release of your book, Good Guys. And I wanted to make a note that we actually do have a signed copy from the two of you that we will be raffling off later today. So for anybody who's able to stay with us through the end of the program, one lucky recipient will be getting a copy of your book in the mail. So we're very excited about that. So as we get started today, first, I know given your backgrounds coming through the military, the naval program in particular, I'm sure you get a fair amount of questions about why it is you've decided to dedicate your work to the idea of male allyship. So can you tell us a little bit about how both of you landed on this particular topic as the focus of your work?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Well, good morning, everybody, and great to be here with you. So I'm Dave Smith, and I'll give you a little bit of background I think is helpful to understand how Brad and I started this journey, and we do look at it as a learning journey along the way here. But I was a Navy pilot for most of my career, and later on transitioned into the academic world as a professor in sociology. And I taught at the Naval Academy for about 8 years with my good friend, colleague, and co-author, Brad Johnson. I've done all my research as a sociologist in the area of gender, work, and family. So looking at gender perspectives of careers and work and how family interacts there. And Brad, as a clinical psychologist, has done all of his research in the area of mentoring relationships. And so we had many conversations over my early years there at the Naval Academy about how men were often missing when it came to leveling the playing field in terms of providing equal access to resources, important resources like mentoring and sponsoring, the advocacy component that is so critical for the promotion of our careers and advancement and getting all the way to the top. And Brad and I had a conversation about it and said, it's interesting that in particular around mentoring and sponsoring, there's just a dearth of research out there. And so we decided to move forward in doing the research for our first book, which was Athena Rising, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women, which came out in 2016. And it's interesting, as Brad and I were busy talking about Athena Rising and working with a lot of different organizations across the country. Me Too went widespread about a year later, as you might remember, in 2017. And Brad and I found ourselves being pulled more into conversations around allyship and what it meant, not just to be a great mentor or sponsor and be inclusive in terms of your mentoring, but how do guys show up in the workplace every day and just their everyday interactions, the kinds of supportive, collaborative relationships they have with women. And it was really interesting. Once again, we found there was a lot of reluctance and just not an understanding of how important it was for as men for us to be engaged in doing this work and how that really leveled the playing field in the workplace. And so that set us off on our new journey here with Good Guys and doing the research for Good Guys to really understand what women most appreciated in the men that they considered to be allies in the workplace and what they did, the specific actions and behaviors that they did, and to share those with other men out there. Brad, you want to share a little more about how we went about that?
Yeah, absolutely. When Dave and I were first, I remember starting our work on Athena Rising, and we would share with colleagues, hey, we want to write a book on how men can be more effective mentors and sponsors for women. We would sometimes get a pause in people we shared that with, and they would say, you realize you're two dudes, right? You're two men. Why would you write a book about, sponsoring, mentoring women? And we get that, absolutely. So I think it's important to know our methodology was to pull together all the existing research on what great cross-gender mentorship looks like. In the latest book, what allyship looks like in the workplace. But then we went out and interviewed lots and lots of women, and we asked them, as Dave said, hey, in your career, have you been mentored by a male? And many women had. And we said, well, what did it look like when it was done really well? And then we used the same methodology for Good Guys. We asked almost 60 women who were all at the top of their careers and professions, what has allyship looked like in behavioral terms? And then we've compiled all of that and tried to sort of develop the toolbox for men to sort of implement daily when they show up to work. How can I really show up as a better collaborator and an accomplice for women in the workplace? So that's been our methodology. And then just a last comment, Dave, I think outlined sort of the research and business case for why we got interested in this, but there's also a personal connection for both of us. Both of us have women in our lives who have done really kind of very similar career things to us. Dave's wife is also a Naval Academy graduate. He got to watch her go through her Navy career. My only sibling is a sister, and she's a Navy captain. And I have to just say that she has experienced things in the workplace that I have never even imagined. And so I think there is that moment of empathy for a lot of men when we watch women go through things, and it peaks, the light bulb, it goes on. So I think in our case, it is both the personal connection and the research awareness that has led us into this area that we're both very passionate about.
It's amazing. And I think you've both touched on some points that we are absolutely going to come back and talk about in a little more detail. And I think really the starting point, though, would be, we talk about the business case for diversity. What is the business case for bringing men into the conversation? Why is it so important that men really be invested in this conversation about gender equity in the workplace?
Yeah, so I'll start, and Brad, I know you've got some more to add to that as well. It's interesting that the research is really clear, and it continued. We see more and more of this research coming out every day across industries and professions, that the more gender diversity you have, and this goes for other forms of diversity as well, but we're focused here for a minute on gender. The more gender diversity you have at every level of leadership, the more successful your organization is, the better decisions that you make, the more creativity, the more innovative your organization can be. If you measure your bottom line in terms of profits and losses, like lots of people do, you're more profitable. And for a long time, that was only a, kind of a correlation. There wasn't a whole lot of causality to be able to prove that. And even recently, we've had more research come out now showing the causality there. But it's important that this is not just at one level of the organization. It has to be across the organization at every level of leadership. So all the way to the top, you just can't have a lot of women at the, in the early ranks. And again, we can talk more about kind of the early ranks and why that's important, but at the senior levels, so they can see, right, who they aspire to be and the role models and the path to the top. And again, it affects how we approach decision making, in particular for organizations, how we approach resources and how we're going to make decisions about where resources go and who gets what. And so it's a pretty compelling business case out there, in particular, and it goes beyond just the organization into our society, because it's also important, of course, for families. Because again, today the norm is that we have dual career, dual earner families today, and we're really hurting families without, again, not having equal access to the same levels of pay, of benefits, and for men to participate that in the same way. So we normalize it for women and men.
Yeah, and I will just say there is some really compelling research related to organizations where men are involved and where they're not involved. So there was a substantial study by Boston Consulting Group not long ago where they went out to lots of companies and they asked women specifically, in the last 3 years, is your company making real progress on gender diversity and inclusion? And the number one correlate predicting whether women said yes or no was whether men were actively engaged, where women saw them as engaged. When women said, I see men as very engaged in this conversation, 96% said their company's making real progress. When women said men are not engaged in this, only 30% saw any progress. So this makes a huge difference in whether or not people see progress in this important area. And also just note that we do have a gap here. Men are aspiring to this, but we also are looking at data showing that we men tend to think, yep, we got this and we're making real progress. And oftentimes, the data is not supporting that. So I think we men overestimate the extent to which we're engaged meaningfully in diversity and inclusion. And our female colleagues, when we ask them the same question, say, yeah, no, not so much. And study after study has revealed that.
Yes, I know you've talked about the allyship gap and the fact that that is a very real issue, right? Perception is often not matching reality. So let's help people understand a little bit about how to make that happen, how to match perception and reality. So in the research that you've been doing, what are some examples of what a good ally does look like?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how long this program can be, but Dave and I have got a whole book full of these. So it's always so challenging to pick our favorites. But let me just start with a couple. I know Dave will have several as well. So, just starting with how I show up as a male in the workplace. We heard from so many women that some of this is not complicated, but men, we often miss this, and we have to kind of recalibrate how we show up. So listen, just listen. Don't listen to her with the intent to fix her problem or fix her. Just listen, be a sounding board, be available. Make sure that your female colleagues are included, right? Look around, have some situational awareness. Who's in the meeting and who's not? Who should be here? Who should be leading the meeting? Do women have a place at the table? Are their voices being heard? Are they being interrupted? I have to really increase my situational awareness and make sure that no one is dropping through the cracks. I got to avoid making assumptions about women. I can quickly, as a male, jump to assumptions that, well, she wouldn't want this promotion or she wouldn't be interested in that because she's a busy mom, the motherhood penalty. I have to check myself when that begins to happen. And then, the sponsoring piece. I need to be deliberately networking for female colleagues. We know that men are a little more reluctant to do that, but I have got to be willing to push her forward and nominate her and be thinking about her for new opportunities. So those are just a couple, but we could go on and on. Dave, do you have some other favorites?
Yeah, I think, one of the things in particular about the allyship gap is this, again, if in our research, we found that we interviewed all these men also, that most men want to, or think they are at least, in favor of gender equity, right? They're all about creating equity in the workplace, and there's this belief that they're doing it too, right? But the belief, that aspiration doesn't always match the action, and what we find is that part of it is that they're just not seeing the problem. They don't see it, they don't understand it in the way that they need to be able to fix it, or to understand what action I need to take to correct that or to make it better. And as Brad was saying, having that situational awareness is key to understanding and seeing the problem. And sometimes it's going to take some really hard inward looking for themselves, as well as some education. It's going to take some self-education. They're going to have to ask questions. They're going to have to, again, they need to have more interaction with women, and discussions about what's going on in the workplace, how they experience the workplace, some humility. And again, I don't, as a guy, I don't necessarily, maybe I don't know what it's like to be a woman in the workplace. I haven't necessarily walked a mile in your shoes there. So I've got to be able to be humble and show some humility about what I don't know, and really learn from women and their experiences there. And this developing of the awareness, once you have the awareness of it, then you can begin to start using that situational awareness and watching for it. An example Brad and I had, for us personally, and we always like to share our personal stories here with these because it's kind of fun, that we were doing the interviews for both books, Athena Rising and Good Guys. We had countless women who would tell us multiple stories about how they were in a meeting and they had this great idea, they put it out there, this contribution, and everybody just kind of looked at it and was like, yeah, okay, whatever. And 3 guys later, he repackages it as his own, and now it's the greatest idea since sliced bread. And we call this bro appropriation, right? When guys take credit for and steal women's ideas in various ways. And I just remember after hearing this several times, I asked Brad and I said, hey, have you ever had that happen to you? And he goes, no, I've never had that happen either. And so if you've never seen it or experienced it, then you have no idea what you're looking for. And now that I know what it is, I can see it. And then when I recognize it, I can make a decision, a choice about, all right, so what am I going to do in the moment? When I see it happening, and I might choose to say something and go, oh, well, Brad, I'm sorry, but how is that any different than what Amy just said? Or I'd like to hear more about Amy's idea because I think she's really onto something important here, and we ought to look at this a little further. But there's different ways that we can do that. The other thing that's kind of inherent in, as we talk about allyship in particular, is that there's kind of 2 parts to this. One is the interpersonal, largely what we've been talking about here, and just how as an individual, as a guy, I show up in the workplace, the kinds of relationships I have, holding myself accountable for my own behavior, my own language. But it's really just about me in that case. And again, this it cannot necessarily lead to a lot of the action that we need to create equity in the workplace and to find the root of some of the problems, the systemic aspects. So that takes the public part of allyship. The interpersonal is kind of the easy part because it's just you. But the public piece is where guys have got to really put themselves out there, put some skin in the game, take some risk. And we do acknowledge that there is risk involved in this, both career, personal, professional risk that they may be taking. But women have been doing this forever. It's time for us as guys to do our part in doing this as well. And so the public piece is really, hey, when you see something, you got to say something. You have to do something. If you are an ally, you do not have a choice. Because if you have a choice, that's your privilege to not do something, and you have to use your privilege for good in this case. And so we have to confront, and sometimes that's hard, and we can talk more about confronting other men. Brad and I just recently wrote another article in Harvard Business Review about the challenges of how we do this as guys for each other, and confronting each other and providing that feedback to each other, because it's critical to really changing behavior.
You both are covering so many topics that I know our audience is really intrigued to talk about. And so we will come back to a lot of these things. And I think you've brought up the idea of humility, which I think is first a really important aspect of this, right? And then also, having some experience because you've maybe experienced it or not experienced it yourself, or you have somebody in your family who you deeply care about, who you're worried about. And so kind of before we dive into a lot of the work, let's also talk about the motivation for the work. And last webinar, we had Jodi Cantor here talking about breaking the Harvey Weinstein story. And she said one of their critical pieces of research came through Harvey Weinstein's accountant, Erwin Ryder. And, for quite a long time, he was struggling with how to fix the situation, how to do something about it. And he says it was really his daughter calling him out and saying, you have to do something, that was the impetus for him to move forward. So can you talk a little bit about how it is you've seen men become motivated to take the charge, sort of how they come to this realization and recognition that they need to be part of the solution?
Yeah, I can begin, but Dave, we have so many of these motivations that are important. We've already kind of alluded to the business case, Amy, and there are some men, and especially some men in leadership, who focus on the numbers, right? It's an aha moment when I realize, hey, these companies that have more diversity in leadership are performing better. And if we don't get our act together here, we are going to miss the boat. We're not going to be prepared to be competitive in the market unless we have more real diversity. So some men are motivated by that. Other men are motivated by personal relationships. Women they care about. It could be a spouse, it could be a partner, it could be a daughter. I can't tell you how many men say that, it was the birth of my daughter that got me really concerned about this. And sometimes he may get a little pushback because, understandably, women may say, really, dude, you had to have a daughter to get concerned about justice and fairness. And well, sometimes the answer is yes. That piques empathy in some men. Another motivation, that I see, and kind of getting to your question, Amy, is men who see other men that they admire step into this role, especially junior men. If I see a senior male step up and advocate for equity and inclusion and do that in a meaningful way, it can be quite empowering for junior men in the organization. And you'll hear junior men say, I so admired, this guy saying that in the meeting, or making it very clear this was a priority, or calling out something inappropriate, that it gave me a roadmap for how to do that. It kind of helped me get unfrozen, as it were. So sometimes a community of men who care about this can be an important, launch pad for other men. Dave, oh, go ahead, Amy.
Well, I was just going to say real quickly, either of you, we had an interesting question actually from one of our participants, which was, do you find that younger men are more open to this idea because many of them have seen their mothers in the workplace?
Yeah, and there's actually research that backs that up as well, that we find that the younger generation of men entering the workplace today and have been in the workplace for the last decade or so, more egalitarian, right, in their approach to gender roles, work and family roles, and their expectations about what that is, about what their partner will be doing or not doing, what they should be entitled to. And I think there's a little bit of entitlement expectation that puts some pressure on the organizations today to have benefits and things like paid sick leave and paid parental leave and opportunities to be able to do those kinds of, there's an expectation of balance, I think, that's there. The challenge is that when they show up, obviously, to these often very traditional workplaces, is they're met with a lot of resistance. And this is where, again, I think in particular, millennials or in Gen Z often get a little bit of a bad rap because they run into this and then they're often leaving those workplaces to go find something that's a better fit for them, a better match for their expectations and what they're looking for. But it's not as clean and simple as that, because what we find also in the research is that, okay, yes, their attitudes have shifted between generations, but in many cases, the behavior and the actions haven't caught up yet when we look at the workplace. And so we do find that there's still a gap when it comes to the behaviors and actions that these men are taking in the workplace. And then there's still, terrible examples of really toxic cultures in different industries out there. And certainly the venture capital world has, there's a number of examples there. Tech has a number of examples. If you haven't read Brotopia, Emily Chang's book, I mean, it'll be shocking to you to see that, yes, there may be for some of you that these things are going on in our country still, and these are very young people. So generationally, there are some differences, but at the same time, there's some challenges we have even with the younger generation as they're coming into the workplace.
Interesting. So I know another challenge, and this has also come up in our discussion in our chat, is Me Too, right? So we are talking about motivations and why men may or may not jump on board. Even men with best of intentions who might have been in support of gender equality and what it takes to get there may have really taken a step back because of the very outspoken Me Too movement. So how have you seen that, come to fruition or manifest in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, we started with that with Athena Rising, and it continued on with Good Guys. Brad, you wanna jump into that one a little bit?
Oh, yeah, it's my favorite topic, Amy, this whole Me Too thing. I mean, it's been so frustrating for Dave and I to see this data. Bloomberg, Lean In, doing these research pieces showing that up to 60% of men in the corporate world are now saying, yeah, I'm just not comfortable mentoring a woman or having lunch, for goodness sake, or a coffee meeting with a woman. It's dangerous. And Dave and I think our tolerance, we have to get more patient with men who have these narratives about what Me Too is about, but we really need to push back on this. So no, let's remind men, let's remind our colleagues who are male, Me Too is really, really pretty simple. Women are asking to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed. It's a super low bar for dudes to get over. And unfortunately, we're hearing all these false narratives, that now women are dangerous. They're scary, can't talk to them at work. And that is ridiculous. There's not a shred of data to support that. Dave and I have looked for the data because you hear men say, well, I heard about a guy who got accused falsely. And that's usually the quality of the data, that they have. There is no data showing that women in any measurable numbers make false accusations. So men have got to own this. We have to deal with our own anxiety. As a clinical psychologist, I'll just tell you there's only one treatment for anxiety, and that's exposure therapy. So I got to have more lunches, more conversations, more coffee meetings with my female colleagues, and I have to deal with my own anxiety. I have to do that through experience and exposure. But we can't tolerate these false narratives about Me Too. So Dave and I are pretty no nonsense about that. But anything else on Me Too, Dave?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Perfect. So one of the things that I really think sets your book Good Guys apart from some others that I've read on this, and I think Dave, you alluded to this in talking about sort of that interpersonal piece, is the fact that you do address the concept of systemic allyship. And so what it really means to be pushing back on a broader organization and not just on your interpersonal relationships. So can you talk about some of the strategies that you put forth in the book that are necessary to move for change at that level?
Yeah, and this is, I think, to me, this is what we're trying to get to. The interpersonal is like a starting point, I think, in many ways for us, because it's a way to engage on an individual level with men and what they can do like right now to get them started in this. But where we're trying to get to is the ability to whatever level you are in your organization, if you're a brand new employee all the way to the CEO, is you have the ability, you understand the everyday practices that are going on wherever you work. And as we begin to understand what those practices are, that's where, again, bias is created, and it's not just gender bias, right? We're focused here kind of narrowly around gender for just a moment, but it expands beyond this. All this is translatable. So we could talk more about racial bias. We could look at intersectional bias. We could look at LGBTQ. It goes on, right? That bias in different ways is created in the everyday practices of what we do in our business. And so as you begin to understand how the bias is created, then you can look for it in your organization. And then once you found it, then, okay, now what do I do? How do we correct this and use that? One of the challenges we find is, people will ask us, where do we start with this? Do we start at the bottom, kind of grassroots? Do we go after middle managers? Do we go after the CEO? And the answer is yes, all the above, because it's really helpful in particular to have senior leadership buy-in, as you know, especially if we're trying to have an initiative to affect change out there. And in particular, back to kind of understanding your motivation for doing the work. CEOs, the senior leaders, have to have some real clarity about how they talk about this, the messaging they have, because it's important. People are listening. They're watching you, how you role model this, what you talk about is important to them. It's important to you. So but what you find is that a lot of times senior leaders, especially senior men, white men, have a hard time talking about gender. They have a hard time talking about diversity or women or race, whatever the case might be. It makes them really uncomfortable. And so we've got to begin to, again, acknowledge that discomfort and begin to get comfortable with it and talking about it. It's really useful to have that personal connection. Find that story, that narrative that you have about what makes you really interested in this and why you're working at this, and then connect it to the business. It's got to be connected to the business, the mission, whatever it is you do in your organization, because at the end of the day, everybody's really busy. We have a lot of things on our plate, and something will inevitably fall off. And if it's not connected to the core business, it's probably not going to get done. We're not going to get the results that we're looking for out there. So having a lot of, I think, some clarity about that. The second part of it is really about transparency and being very transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And again, sometimes diversity and inclusion initiatives can kind of become these dirty little secrets. It's hush hush, and oh, it's a quota, or it's a this, or it's that, and and people, it doesn't build trust. It does not, engender trust in an organization. And so we have to be very transparent about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then the how we're doing it. The progress piece is so critical. So people see that. It's, again, they go, wow, okay, so we're trying this and maybe it's not working as well, but here's what we're going to do to change it up, to make it better, right? And it engenders that trust within the organization amongst your employees. If you're transparent externally, it's also good for you, because guess what? Investors are looking at these things today. They're looking at how you talk about these initiatives, how you're doing, how transparent and public you are about this, and in terms of disclosing it. And then, of course, your future employees. The talent pool out there today is looking. They are watching to see who you are, what you do, how important things like diversity and inclusion are to your organization, and what you're working on today. And the final piece of this is accountability. You've got to have accountability for everyone who is doing this work out there. Again, the CEO, if the CEO is not held accountable by the board, guess what? Probably not as critical. We see lots of great examples today. Facebook recently, they were in the news about how their vice presidents and directors and above were all going, in their semi-annual performance reviews, were all going to be held accountable for the goals they had for diversity and inclusion. So tying it to, again, the business part of what you're doing is really important. And the final piece of that, I think, as we're seeing lots of chief diversity officers today being hired across the board out there, not having them maybe work directly in HR. Maybe they have some sort of a relationship, whether it's direct or indirect, to the CEO, to the chief of operations out there, so that they're tied to the business part of what they're doing. So we see the importance of that.
Great points. I did just also want to mention, because in that chapter, I found it great the way you do provide some examples of, one of the ways is you really do have to call out the behaviors that you're seeing that are, counter to gender equity. So can you just share a little bit about that, and whether you think that men have concern if they take those kinds of steps, if that will, negatively impact their own careers?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a whole chapter, I think, devoted to calling stuff out, and this is getting to what Dave referred to as a public part of allyship that I think it's really hard for men. This is so important. So often men are in a meeting, we're at some occasion at work, there's something inappropriate going on, something was said that's biased or egregiously sexist, maybe even a harassing joke, who knows? This happens all the time. The question is, what do we do about it? And all the research on bystander effect shows that within, just a few seconds after that comment gets made, bystander paralysis sets in, and men suffer this, right? So, we're looking around the room after that sexist joke and we're wondering, ooh, is everyone really uncomfortable? Should I say something? I'm almost waiting for verification that one of my female colleagues was upset before I intervene. I can't do that. And so Dave and I talk about the 2-second rule. 2 seconds after that comment, I have to say something. And if you're not sure what to say, just say ouch. And the beauty of the ouch technique is it buys me a few more seconds while everyone in the room is looking at me like, what's wrong with you? And now I can articulate how it didn't land the right way with me. We don't do that here, or I don't appreciate that kind of humor. I'd like you not to talk about women that way again. That's an outdated stereotype. We need to get over that. I need to have a response. And then the other piece of this is I cannot attribute my discomfort to there being a woman in the room. And that happens way too often, right? Like, Bob, hey man, Wendy's in the room. Don't do that. No, that's not okay. I need to say, Bob, I don't appreciate that. And here's why that didn't land the right way with me. Got to own it. And I think we men need to hold each other accountable for this. And Dave and I have some strategies for how to confront other men. We even have our favorite hashtag, bro no. Some men get a little leeway in confronting other men that way. And I can decide, I can go to him after the meeting if I have a relationship with him and what he said wasn't too egregious. I can go to him and say, bro, no. When you said that, we all cringed, and here's why we said that. You need to really watch it. I care about you, and I don't want you to have trouble here. And it's also hurting our work team, and that's not okay. So I can use that. If it's something egregious, I don't have the choice of going to him afterward. I have to call it out right there. And I have to have the courage to do that. We find in the bystander research that when one guy breaks the spell, suddenly the other men come off the sidelines and they're like, yeah, nodding their heads, they're joining you. You're going to create a team of male allies, but you have to have the courage to break that silence initially. And that's not always easy.
Perfect. I think those really specific strategies are what people need to hear more of so that they can start to get that, a little more comfortable, right? It's trying to take a little bit of the discomfort away from actually speaking out. So thank you for sharing some of those. I want to turn to a topic I think is on many people's minds and is, sort of very timely that your book has just come out in this particular environment. We heard in September that in just September alone, 617,000 women dropped out of the workforce. And that number is almost 8 times the number of men who dropped out in the same month. And we know that much of this is being attributed to women having to leave the workforce for caretaking responsibilities. And we do know that, women are struggling whether they are working from home and trying to juggle things, or they're essential workers, or maybe they're single mothers. So there's a lot about, this kind of concept of male allyship that comes into play, whether it's for those essential workers who are in the workplace right now, or for those mothers who are working remotely. So can you talk a little bit about, at least if you think about sort of a married heterosexual couple, how that partnership at home impacts allyship in the workplace, and about how you think the pandemic may have impacted this dynamic?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And, when you read the book, you'll see that one of the first chapters we have right up front is a chapter talking about how gender equity starts in the home. And Brad and I firmly believe, and I think the research backs this very well, that again, if we don't become allies in the home in creating equity, we're never going to change things in the workplace. It's just not going to happen. The research for decades has shown that women are doing 2 to 3 times the amount of division of household labor that guys are doing. And the same thing goes for the rest of the unpaid and invisible labor that goes on in the workplace, in the home, that women are doing, and guys are either just oblivious to it or don't care, or whatever the case might be. They just assume it's the norm and how it is we do it in our family. But it disadvantages women in a way that now has been exacerbated because of the pandemic. Because of there's no childcare, there's very few schools open these days, and so homeschooling now has been added onto the list. And people we've called this the triple shift or the double shift, however you want to look at it. But there's that much more of the unpaid labor is being done at home by women, and it's falling on women's shoulders again. And it's not just the physical labor too, which is, truly demanding, right? And really creating a lot of burnout and stress, anxiety, a lot of mental health issues that we're seeing in the research today. But it's also the emotional labor, the cognitive labor that, again, before the pandemic was going on, and today it's just as bad right now during the pandemic, that keeping track of the endless list, the mental lists that are out there. And we have several stories in the book about how guys are like, yeah, hey, I was at the store and with the kids and I saw these coats on sale, and I was like, oh, they probably need a new winter coat for coming up for the winter here. What size do they wear? I don't know. I'll call my wife. And it's like, again, these are the things that as guys, we are not taking accountability for these actions, right? And that's just one. And it's all the organizing, it's the planning, the tracking, all, again, the mental, emotional labor that it just wears you down after so long. And it takes away from your job. It really does. It's adding to that burnout and that stress that we have in our jobs today. And so again, we start with men and we say, look, you need to first go home and figure out how am I doing at home? If you think you already have kind of an equitable relationship with your partner, ask. Maybe you need an audit. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend Eve Rodsky's book, Fair Play. And she has they even have a little gamified version of it with cards. I mean, you can sit down and you can go through the cards and take accountability for who's doing what. And you own it. When you have that card, it's yours. You have that responsibility for doing the work every day. So critically important. And the other part of this is really about supporting our partners' careers. And we often find that there's this default to guys' careers being the primary out there, when, in fact, we've never had more women today as primary caregivers ever. It's over 40%, or the primary breadwinners today at home. So women are doing it, and yet we often find that men are not supporting their wives' careers in the way that they need to. The final part of this, I would say, and I think this came up in the chat somewhere as well, that I think we need to acknowledge our role as fathers with our kids, and the importance of that. And again, the research is really clear on this and continues to come out about the effect we have when we're involved in our kids' lives, when we have great relationships with our kids, when we're spending time with them, not just taking them to practice, not just doing the kind of the physical tasks that are the day-to-day tasks that have to occur, but emotionally bonding with them. Our sons, when they see us as all in equal allies at home, they have that different perspective, a more inclusive perspective about gender roles, and they take that to the workplace with them, right, when they get there. For our daughters, the research is even better in terms of, we see that when our daughters see us as all in equal allies, and they have to see you doing the work too, by the way, that they're more likely to persist in their careers. They're more likely to reach those career goals, dreams, aspirations, and go into more non-traditional professions and industries out there. So if we're trying to change the gender balance of tech, of finance, of law, we've got to, as dads, we can make a difference in that and being more involved in their lives.
And Amy, can I just add one last thing to Dave's excellent list? If men want to level the playing field in terms of work-family integration, we have to take this to the workplace. Our identities as fathers, our identities as partners, we have to be very public about the fact that we have obligations at home. Too often when men have something, with a kid or with a school event or something else, men sneak out the side door, right? They don't make this very public. And we would be doing our colleagues a big favor and leveling the playing field so this is more normal if we would be very public about it. I have to leave this afternoon and go do something with my family, or I'm on childcare duty today, it's my turn. I need to be public. When we have a new child, I should put on my email automatic response, hey, I'm not going to be here because I'm taking my full parental leave. If men would lean in and take all of that benefit publicly, this wouldn't be just a woman's thing, and we would be helping to level the playing field.
I absolutely love that. I know, actually, I think you talk about sort of general traits of males and females. Women tend to be more open with those types of things. So I've actually coached younger women to say, you don't always have to be so transparent about what you just tell your team you're leaving, right? That's what a man would do. And so this is kind of the opposite. We need to get to that balance of, let's all just be more transparent, right? It kind of benefits everybody.
Yeah, it acknowledges what we all know is there, right? It's there. The
Right.
caregiving responsibility is there. We just don't talk about it, especially as men.
And hopefully, if we try to look at any silver lining out of the pandemic, some of that has become more on display. Although I know that there are still people who say, when a child comes into the frame and a man is on the video call, they get all like, oh, that's great. That's so sweet. Your child walked into the room. And then if it's a woman, they're like, oh, great. She's on mom duty. Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do want to shift gears just a little bit, knowing we're getting close to our time, and I know there have been questions and comments about this coming up through the chat. So I want to talk about intersectionality, because there's an increasing body of work about the impact of gender equity efforts and on women of color, and particularly Black women in the workplace. And we know that the pandemic has had an outsized impact on women of color. I know that the two of you just worked on a Harvard Business Review article on this particular issue. So can you share a little bit about how you see the impact of, let's start with race, but I do think we can broaden to intersectionality in general, how you see that issue manifesting in the work that you're doing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. You know, we partnered with two of our colleagues, Angie Beeman and Sadali Malaku, to write that article and do that research. And the collaboration in and of itself was really interesting and a great learning. I think went both ways for us as we were approaching how to do this. But one of the things that Sadali and Angie had asked Brad and I to do as we were writing the article was to go back, because they knew the research from our book, and said, hey, can you go back and look at the allyship actions, the specific behavioral actions that you had in all the chapters, and can we translate that, if they're not already directly applicable, to something around intersectionality or race or some other form of diversity? Can you translate that? And it was really interesting to see that, with the exception of a lot of the chapter in particular related to gender equity at home, almost everything else translated directly into a race or an intersectionality perspective as we were writing the article out there. But I think the one of the key elements there that kind of came up front and center, I think, for all of us, was that remember that I think as white men in particular, and we were writing this from that perspective, that we have to do our homework again, and there's some self-education here that we have to acknowledge that we need to do. And part of that is understanding the history, and this goes from again, systemic inequities like racism, like sexism. There's a history behind it, and the history within the United States in particular is really I think it's critical to understanding where we are today, and to what I can do, what I should do, or what I have to watch out for myself, and how I have to understand that before I can start moving forward and thinking about, all right, so how do I dismantle this system that has advantaged me for my entire life? Because again, I think that's one of the challenges that we as white men have, is that it's not always clear that, well, why would I want to dismantle a system that has taken care of me and really makes my life easy, right? This is the status quo, and really, but to be an ally for somebody who, again, doesn't look like you, hasn't had the experiences of you've really got to take that on and disrupt that, and be the disruptor of the status quo in a way that, again, is it moving us forward. And you're not here to rescue. I'm not here to rescue women of color. I'm here to do this for the right reasons, because it's good for everybody. It's good for me. It's good for them. It's good for my organization. And coming to grips, I think, with that is really challenging for us.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing to that, Amy, that a big piece of this comes back to humility again. And I have got to enter into conversations with women of color, with Black women, if I'm a white male especially, with a real learning orientation. And I need to be genuine with that. I need to ask curious questions. If I'm not sure that she would want to share something with me about being the only Black woman in her division, I can at least say, I'd like to learn about your experience here. Would it be okay if I asked you blank? So I can ask to ask. And I think that over time, I need to really work at establishing trust with people who don't look like me, and I want to build Dave and I kind of call it a tribe of really diverse women around me who I'm going to learn from, who are going to trust me enough to give me honest, authentic feedback when I'm getting something wrong. This is really how men get better, by doing the work to create trust with women they work with. And I think that's when men are getting great feedback and finding out how they can be better sponsors and mentors and collaborators.
Absolutely. I think, when you've followed any of the work around racial injustice, one of the things that really shines is having some conversation, right? So too many people are afraid of starting the conversation because they're afraid they're either going to say something wrong or they don't know the answer. But what's critical is that they do take that step, and that's where that humility comes in, that it's okay to say you don't know, that you don't have the answer. You might even start by saying, I might say something wrong, but I'm here to learn. Please teach me, right? And so I love your point about humility, because I think that's really at the core of whether it's, having a conversation with a woman as a white man, or having a conversation with a Black male, or a Black female, or an Asian coworker. It's all about the humility. Great point. Really appreciate all of your strategies, because again, I think that's where people start to say, we're excited, we're on board, but how do we make this happen, right? So I want to kind of, as we're getting close to the end of our time, move into that a little bit more. As we know that the pandemic seems to be with us for a while longer, and whether we are working remotely or virtually because of the pandemic, or because post-pandemic organizations have made decisions to keep more people working remotely, it does impact our ability to create relationships, to have conversations, and people are struggling with that a little bit. So do you have any tips or advice for, let's start with women who may be trying to encourage colleagues or bring men along this journey of allyship for women, knowing that we might be kind of in this virtual environment for a while? I will start with saying that a great idea is to get your book and give it to them. But aside from that, do you have any thoughts about ways to help women bring men along?
Yeah. There's so many pieces to this, but I love the idea of, looking for the kind of, we call it the small wins, so if I'm a woman looking around in my organization, looking for guys who kind of get something right maybe in a real micro moment or just a small example, letting them know, hey, I really appreciated it when you did that. And here's why it mattered to me when you said that, or when you noticed something going on in a meeting, or when you included me because you saw that my name wasn't on the invite list for that Zoom meeting. That meant a lot to me. And often, it sounds so small to say that to a guy, but we all react to reinforcement. And I guarantee you're going to get more of that from him if he knows that was a good thing or that was useful. And so I like using the affirmation and the reinforcement. I would also look for guys who have a heart for this work. And I think people know what I mean by that. These are the guys who just kind of do this, the allyship. They have the humility. They have an openness to learning. They care about justice. We all sort of know who these guys are. And I would love to start with those men as kind of a nucleus of my male ally cohort or network in the company, and say, hey, would you guys partner with our women's ERG to launch a male ally, network, or, or your own sort of subgroup within the women's ERG of men supporting this effort? And those are often the men who will say yes, and they'll be persuasive leaders for the more junior men, and they'll bring them on board. So I would look for those guys that are always already showing glimmers of really great allyship, and try and leverage them into leadership.
Yeah, I think there's, again, making it very tactical, looking at the everyday things that you're doing. For example, hiring employment processes are still hopefully going on for the most part during the pandemic. And but even if it's not hiring, if it's a promotion process or something, advancement selection, whatever the case might be, and you're involved in that, I think asking very well-placed questions to men will kind of spur their curiosity and their interest about, I'm not really sure. So for example, if you have a hiring committee and you look at the pool of applicants and you go, wow, there aren't really many women in this pool. I wonder why that is, and asking them, and see if you can engage them in a conversation that gets, again, this little bit of curiosity about, well, that shouldn't be that way. There should be 50-50 or whatever the case might be, what you would expect to find in your pool, or what you would like to have there. The same thing for promotions. Again, wow, it's really interesting that after we get past the kind of the first level of management in our company, suddenly there aren't many women at this point, or there aren't many women of color, especially at this point. I wonder why that is. And engage them in a conversation. And again, I think that the men in particular, as Brad said, that are prone to doing the work already, or have that mindset, or that again, that attitude about this that you can approach and engage them, I think is really helpful. And then getting them to engage with other men at the same time, again, developing that curiosity, that instinct that, something's amiss here, something's not quite right. We ought to look at that about why that is. And then challenging, when you get the opportunity, then to begin to challenge some of the perceptions, the stereotypes, the biases that cause, right, the differences that we find there.
Perfect. I love that you brought up, Brad, the topic of ERGs, because I know, many organizations who have employee resource groups have a women-focused group. And I think there's sometimes this kind of interesting dynamic where they can be viewed as kind of just this group of women who are complainers, who are, always kind of at this women don't get enough of a fair shake kind of thing. And it makes men very hesitant to kind of engage with the ERGs, or there's just sort of this question of how do we do that, right? But it seems very critical that that is happening, that there is a way to kind of invite men into the women's resource group ERG so that they can start to open up the dialogue a little bit more and not make it this, it's that group of women over there who are always complaining about everything.
Yeah,
Terrific.
and
Well,
yep. Oh no, wait. I would probably need to get to Q&A, but we could talk about that specific thing for another hour.
I'm sure you could. I know that you could.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know we do have about 2 minutes left before 10 o'clock, believe it or not. It's been an amazing conversation. And I know we've had a lot of activity in our chat with people kind of amplifying some of the points and finding it refreshing to hear the conversation that the two of you have brought today. And again, really appreciate some of the strategies that you shared, because I know for people who have an inclination, the hardest thing is, where do I begin, right? So I guess any sort of last thoughts along those lines as we come to a close?
Yeah, last thoughts. Gosh, Dave, there's so much here. I'm just going to follow up, I think, Amy, on your last really excellent point about, because Dave and I talked to men in the book about how do you show up when you're invited to an event, when the women's ERG does host something and they say, hey, men are welcome here, or when they start a male allyship subgroup, maybe connected to the ERG in the company. How do you show up there as a guy? And we have some recommendations for men. Show up and listen. Keep your yapper shut. Learn. Find out what you need to know. Make it a real learning opportunity. Self-educate when you're there. And then at the right moment, ask your female colleagues, how can I contribute? Or what's the right role for me here? Again, kind of back to our humility. I want to understand the role I can play. Too many men, I think, have a natural inclination to show up and take over and become the spokesman and tell women how to solve equity. And we just find that is absolutely the wrong recipe for how to be in those spaces.
Yeah, I would just say two things. One, back to the home. I hope all the guys out there today will go back to their partner at home and have that, hopefully, a very open and honest discussion about all right, so how am I doing? How can we make this more equitable in supporting each other at home for the good of you, for, our family, for our kids, and then take that back, into the workplace as well to share with others. I think the last piece there is really about remembering that there is going to be some risk here for guys that when they start to speak up, and it's not just from a confrontation perspective, but it can also be when you're recommending or you're advocating on behalf of, or you're doing that sponsoring for a woman. But look around sometimes and see, hey, do I only push forward people who look like me? And how am I not recognizing some of the talent that's around here that doesn't look like me, women of color, other women in the organization, and take a chance and push them forward when you recognize that talent, and do that, because it will make it a tremendous difference. And you'll see when it pays off, then share that with other people, share it with the other guys that, again, not to brag about it, but to say, hey, we did this and it worked out really well, and here's why, and you should think about it too.
Amazing. Can't thank you guys enough for your thoughts and your insight today, and the work that you've been doing and continue to do to support gender equity. Before we sign off quickly, I just wanted to note we do have a winner for your book. So, and I apologize if I mispronounce her name, Anupama Vishwamitra. We will reach out to you following the session to get a mailing address for you and get that book out to you. We also want to thank again our sponsors. So InvestNet, Insight, Richards, Leighton and Finger, Delaware Business Times, and Delaware Prosperity Sharp Partnership. Thank you so much for helping us make this possible for all of our community out there. So have a wonderful rest of your Friday, and everyone who had joined us today, be on the lookout for Dave and Brad. You can follow them on LinkedIn. They have amazing activity and sessions that they're doing. So follow them if you can. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.